Yet time, too, created new ones. Robert, frustrated with the lack of an heir, fell back into the arms of ale and women. His appetites for drink and carnal pleasures were a poor imitation of the love he had once sought. Lyanna did not protest outwardly, but it pained her to see her husband slipping away, turning into a man haunted by bitterness. She could not share the truth of Jon's parentage, nor would she want to, so she watched in silence, often retreating to the godswood of the Red Keep, where a lone weirwood stood with carved face, though its strength felt faint in the southern climate. In the north, Jon grew into a quiet, thoughtful boy. He latched onto any scrap of knowledge about House Stark and its history, from the crypts beneath Winterfell to the tales of the Kings of Winter. He looked up to Ned with reverence, but he also watched Robb Stark, born soon after Ned's return from the war, and recognized as Ned and Catelyn's trueborn son, with something akin to envy. Robb had all the inheritance, the name, the expectation of leadership. Jon, for all that Ned loved him, bore only the name Snow, and with it the stigma of bastardy. Still, the two boys formed a bond, playing together in the yard, chasing each other through the halls. Arya and Sansa had not yet been born, nor Brandon or Rickon, so Jon and Robb were the only children, forging a brotherhood that sometimes baffled the adults with its intensity. Ned watched them play with an ache in his chest, wishing they could know the truth, but knowing it could never be so. The realm endured. Robert's rule was not without its challenges. Banditry in the Reach, skirmishes in the Riverlands from restless lords, the constant threat of Greyjoy raiders in the west. But overall, the peace held. The Targaryen threat was far away, across the sea, and most of Westeros seemed content with the Storm King who had overthrown the Mad King. Taxes were collected, justice was meted out, and the small folk slowly recovered from the ravages of war. In King's Landing, the nobles entertained themselves with intrigues, petty rivalries, and lavish feasts. The crown's coffers were not as full as they might be. Robert enjoyed spending gold on tournaments and celebrations, but for now it was manageable. Lyanna, as queen, did what she could to keep Robert from spending the realm into ruin, cautioning him on the expenses of hosting too many grand events. Her greatest ally in this was Jon Arryn, who had guided Robert since he was a ward in the Vale. The two of them, along with Stannis, formed a stable core of leadership. Robert the figurehead warrior king, Jon Arryn the wise counselor, Stannis the strict enforcer. Lyanna acted as a balancing presence, using her stark pragmatism to remind them of the needs of the small folk. She traveled occasionally to the surrounding countryside, awarding boons to farmers, hearing their grievances. This earned her a measure of admiration, though some lords sneered that a queen's place was in a castle, not out riding among peasants. After 6 years of marriage, Robert and Lyanna still had no children. The realm was beginning to mutter more loudly about an heir. Some suggested that Robert might put her aside in favor of a more fertile bride. Others urged Lyanna to pray at the Great September Daily, to beg the Seven for a child. But Lyanna followed the old gods, not the Seven, and though she prayed, she refused to do so under the watch of Septons she did not trust. Robert, for his part, seemed torn between his love for the memory of the woman Lyanna had been and his bitterness toward the Targaryen legacy. Still, he did not cast her aside. The very idea repulsed him, for he had fought a war to claim her. To discard her like some used garment would be a betrayal of everything he had believed in. And so they continued on, locked in a marriage that neither fully embraced nor wholly rejected. Meanwhile, in Winterfell, Ned's family continued to grow. Catelyn gave birth to daughters, Sansa and Arya, and then another boy, Bran, each time forcing Ned to confront his deceptions anew. Each time a new Stark child was born, Jon watched from the sidelines, uncertain of his place in this ever-growing family. Ned tried to show him as much affection as possible, but he sensed Jon's growing awareness that he was different. Servants sometimes called him the bastard behind his back, or pitted him for his uncertain standing. Robb loved Jon like a brother, but the rest of the world saw them as fundamentally separate. One trueborn, one baseborn. Letters from Lyanna trickled in less frequently over the years. She remained queen, but her tone turned more resigned, as if she had accepted that no child would come of her marriage to Robert. She always asked about John. Ned told her as much as he could, how John was taking lessons from Maester Luwin, how he excelled at sword practice for his age. At times, Lyanna's letters would grow wistful, and Ned could almost see her tears in the ink. But she never wavered in her resolve that the secret must remain hidden. She never asked to have John return to her, or to bring him south. It was too dangerous. On one cold winter's night, when John was nearly 8, Ned found the boy standing by the window in the great keep, staring out at the falling snow. A half-moon glimmered overhead, and the courtyard below was hushed, blanketed in white. "Father," John said softly, not turning around, "is my mother dead?" The question hit Ned like a blow. Slowly, he stepped forward. "Why do you ask, John?" John shrugged, a gesture filled with heartbreak. "Rob, Sansa, and Arya all have a mother. I hear men talk in the yard sometimes. They say my mother was a tavern wench or something else." His voice trembled with a child's indignation. "But they don't really know. I asked old Nan once, and she said I should speak to you." Ned exhaled, remembering Lyanna's face when she had held John, remembering the promise. "Your mother is gone," he said as gently as he could. "I cannot speak of her. I promised I would not." John's eyes were dark with confusion and hurt. "Why can't you?" "I gave my word, John," Ned said. "I know it is hard, but trust me when I say that I love you, and if I could tell you the whole truth, I would. One day, perhaps, but not yet." He placed a hand on John's shoulder. "Know this. She was highborn, and she had a gentle heart. She loved you very much." The boy's face flickered, a swirl of emotions crossing it. At last he nodded, swallowing hard. "I believe you." Ned pulled him into a hug, the sort of embrace he wished Lyanna could give him. John stiffened at first, then melted into his father's arms, clinging to him. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and inexorable, as though it would cover every secret in the world. Life went on. The realm changed slowly under King Robert's reign, expansions and small conflicts popping up like weeds. Tywin Lannister, who had kept his distance initially, began to reassert his house's power at court, forging alliances and offering loans to the crown. Robert, strapped for gold, accepted. Stannis proved an able master of ships, but seldom found joy in the capital's intrigues. Renly, charismatic and clever, gained favor among the lords and ladies, forming friendships and alliances that would eventually prove significant. And through it all, Lyanna remained queen, drifting through her daily duties with a certain stoic grace. She performed her role well enough that the small folk regarded her with cautious fondness. The songs about the Wolf Queen were fewer than those about the rebellious hero king, but they existed, weaving a tale of a northern rose transplanted to the south, struggling to bloom in an alien garden. One day, a letter arrived in Winterfell, written in Lyanna's hand but carrying Robert's seal. It requested that Ned come south for a grand tournament the king was hosting at Harrenhal, to celebrate the anniversary of the rebellion's victory, ironically enough, in the very place that had once sparked Rhaegar's interest in Lyanna. The letter invited Ned to bring his wife and children, and to bring the boy Snow, if he pleased. Ned wondered at that. Did Robert truly invite John? Or was that courtesy from Lyanna, disguised under Robert's name? Either way, it gave Ned pause. Perhaps the time had come for John to see more of the realm, though it risked exposing him to curious eyes. Still, if the queen wished it, Ned would not refuse. Catelyn was hesitant at the idea of John accompanying them, but Ned insisted. He believed that if the king and queen themselves had invited him, no one could reasonably object. And so, with a large retinue, House Stark departed Winterfell. Robb and Jon rode side by side on their small ponies, the older lords and knights of the north surrounding them. Sansa, Arya, and Bran traveled by wheelhouse, guarded by men-at-arms. A small group of household servants and guard captains completed the procession. The journey was long, and the children often complained, but they passed the time telling stories, playing games, and marveling at the changing landscape. When at last the monstrous towers of Harrenhal rose on the horizon, their scorched stone seeming to claw at the sky, Ned felt a shiver of memory. He remembered the tourney Rhaegar had won, the crown of winter roses, the events that had set this entire tragedy into motion. Jon, of course, knew nothing of that. He only stared at the broken towers with wide eyes, remarking on how large and ominous they looked. Robert and Lyanna had already arrived at Harrenhal, along with half the realm, it seemed. Colorful pavilions spread over the fields outside the castle's blackened walls, bearing the sigils of many houses. Lannister crimson and gold, Tyrell green and gold, Tully red and blue, Arryn sky blue and white, Baratheon black and gold, and a flurry of lesser banners. The noise of thousands of people mingled with the smell of cooking fires and horse dung, a cacophony that startled the children. Ned escorted his family through the throng, eventually presenting himself at the royal pavilion. King Robert emerged first, dressed in fine leathers, a stag's head embroidered on his tunic. He had gained some muscle and a hint of girth in the years since the war, but he still carried himself like a warrior. Queen Lyanna stood at his side, wearing a gown of dark blue trimmed with ermine, her hair bound in a silver net. Her face lit with a subtle warmth when she saw Ned and the children, but her eyes flicked to Jon, who hung back uncertainly. Lyanna's composure nearly broke for a heartbeat, an emotion so profound crossing her features that Ned thought she might run to him. But she steeled herself, managing only a small smile. They exchanged polite greetings in front of the assembled courtiers. The children bowed to the king and queen. Lyanna's gaze lingered on Jon, but she masked it well, praising all of them for their long journey. Robert boomed laughter, clasping Ned's arm, welcoming him like a brother. For a moment, it almost felt like old times, before the war, before the heartbreak. Almost. Preparations for the tournament were elaborate. Over the next few days, lords and ladies arrived from every corner of the realm. There were feasts each night, music and dancing, and during the day, the lists were crowded with knights eager to win fame. Ned noticed that Robert, though he participated in some of the feasting with gusto, also grew impatient with the formalities. He wanted the melees, the justs, the thrill of combat. He'd never been a man for long speeches or empty pomp. Lyanna, for her part, played the queen well, graceful, composed. Some of the older ladies muttered that her bearing was too severe, too stark, but others found her regal in her own way. When she rode out to watch the justs, she did so on a spirited black mare, wearing a cloak of gray wool. Servants whispered that she looked like a beautiful ghost among the vibrant crowds. She rarely smiled, though, and when she did, it was often in Jon's direction from afar. Jon himself was wide-eyed with wonder at the tournament. He followed Ned around, absorbing every sight. 100 pavilions, shining armor, galloping destriers, the thunder of lances on shields. Robb stuck close to him, equally enthralled. Sansa gasped at the finery, while Arya pestered everyone to let her ride or watch the squires train. Bran was too young to pay close attention, but he clapped happily whenever knights thundered past. Ned felt a mix of pride and sadness, remembering the old days with his siblings. One afternoon, as the justs continued, Ned found himself seated beside King Robert in the stands, while Lyanna sat on Robert's other side. Jon and Robb were nearby with Catelyn, Sansa, and Arya. The final tilt of the day was a fierce match between the Kingsguard's finest knight, Ser Barristan Selmy, and a bold challenger from the Reach. When the lances shattered and the crowd roared, Ned noticed Lyanna's gaze drifting to Jon, who was perched at the edge of his seat, enthralled by the joust. There was such longing in her eyes that Ned's heart ached. She caught him looking and quickly averted her eyes, returning to the display of knights. But Ned could not unsee that moment. A dozen questions swirled in his mind. Would Robert ever allow her to acknowledge Jon, even in private? Had they reached some unspoken understanding that they would never speak of it? Or did Lyanna yearn for an impossible future, wishing she could love her son openly? When the joust ended, Robert stood and cheered, raising a horn of ale in Ser Barristan's honor. The crowd erupted in cheers, celebrating the legendary knight who had served the realm faithfully. At the same moment, Ned saw a flicker of sadness pass over Lyanna's face, as if the spectacle reminded her of Rhaegar's triumphs. Then she composed herself, putting on a serene mask. The entire realm looked upon her as their queen, unaware of the heartbreak in her soul. That evening, a feast was held in Harrenhal's great hall, a cavernous space that still bore the scars of dragonfire centuries ago. The torches and candles only made the shadows dance on the walls like living ghosts. Minstrels sang, jugglers performed, and course after course of food was served. Ned sat with his family near the high table, where Robert and Lyanna presided. The noise was deafening. Laughter, conversation, the clang of cups and plates. Partway through the feast, Jon slipped away from the table. Ned noticed but assumed the boy wanted to explore, as children often did at such gatherings. Maybe he wished to see the minstrels up close or watch the jugglers juggle flaming torches. But after some minutes passed, Ned decided to seek him out, not wanting the boy to wander too far. He made polite apologies to Catelyn and rose from his seat, scanning the crowds. Eventually, Ned caught sight of Jon near a side doorway, and beside him, wearing a dark cloak over her gown, was Lyanna. Ned's heart tightened. He edged closer without drawing attention, stepping behind a pillar so as not to intrude. Lyanna was kneeling before Jon, speaking to him softly, a tenderness in her voice that Ned had not heard in years. Jon gazed at her with shy curiosity. She reached out to brush a stray curl from his forehead. Though Ned could not hear the exact words, he sensed the warmth in her tone, the long-suppressed love of a mother for her child. Jon tilted his head, something like recognition flickering in his eyes, but he did not speak. Perhaps he thought this was merely the queen kindly greeting him. Or perhaps, in his young heart, he felt something more. Then, unexpectedly, Robert's voice echoed from across the hall. He was calling for his queen, a hint of impatience in his tone. Lyanna stiffened. She gently placed a hand on Jon's shoulder, murmured a final word, and then stood, stepping away as if she could not bear to linger. She cast one glance back at Jon, the look of a mother forced to abandon her child, and then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. Jon stared after her, brows furrowed in puzzlement, before turning away, sighing softly. Ned emerged from behind the pillar, extending a hand to Jon. The boy took it, a faint frown on his lips. Ned could see the questions in his eyes, but Jon said nothing. Together, they returned to their seats, as music swelled and the feast continued. Lyanna had rejoined Robert at the high table, wearing the same distant look she often wore. If any lords or ladies noticed her brief absence, none spoke of it. The secrets held in Harrenhal's shadows remained unspoken, and the realm's illusions stayed intact. Such was the fragile tapestry of their lives. A queen bound by duty, a king fighting his demons, a lord sworn to keep a promise, a child raised in shadows. And yet, despite it all, the realm continued on. The seasons cycled, and the people sang songs of victory and love, unaware of the heartbreak woven into the new order. In the end, Lyanna Stark had survived the Tower of Joy, but she lived with a different kind of sorrow, a slow, steady ache that came from burying her motherhood in secrecy. Jon Snow would grow up thinking he was Ned Stark's son, a bastard of Winterfell, never knowing that the Queen in King's Landing watched him from afar with love and regret. Robert Baratheon would carry on, drinking and laughing and warring, crowed as the man who won the realm, never fully reconciling his feelings for the woman he had wed or the legacy she bore. And Ned Stark would shoulder his promise alone, guarding the boy who might one day change the fate of Westeros, son of ice and fire, raised as a snow in the frozen north. In that distant future, if the winds of winter should howl and darkness descend upon the realm, the truth might emerge like a torch in the night. But for now, the secret was safe and the realm was at peace. And Lyanna Stark, Lyanna Baratheon, remained the wolf that lived but never roamed free, her heart forever torn between the family she loved and the throne she had never truly desired.